Hello, welcome to the first installment in a new series where I talk about fake crystals that are on the market and how you can help yourselves to become informed buyers so you can identify them and hopefully not buy fakes if that's something that you don't want. So in today's video, I'm talking about citrine and some of the fakes out there. When I recorded this, I didn't understand how long it was going to be, and that's because there's a lot of controversy around citrine and what's defined as fake citrine. So this video talks about what citrine is and its defining qualities and characteristics. I'm covering three different fakes. I'm talking about glass, quartz, and iron-coated quartz. And lastly, I put in a summary of how topaz has been used in the past to fake citrine and why we don't see that too much these days anymore. The second part of this fake citrine discussion will be its own video coming out soon, and I'm gonna break down the actual, like, more controversial fakes because there's lies built around them in very disingenuous ways from a lot of large sources that are seen as reputable. So we break down how these lies have been propagated and perpetuated so long and how new generations of not just buyers but sellers are not understanding what real citrine is. So in that video, we cover smoky quartz and amethyst fakes and how we get those crystals to mimic citrine. So if you want to become a more informed buyer, if you've heard about this or you haven't and you just want to like freshen up on this, I hope this is a great resource for you now and maybe in the future if you want a reminder. So let's get into this. All right, let's get into this. So I'm showing my full screen here for transparency so that you guys can go to any of these websites if you want. I'm only gonna link down below the ones that are like super impactful or reputable. So like a couple of the blogs I won't link just because I have, so many tabs. It would be really hard to navigate through all those links. So this is the Jewelers of America's official website, and here's their example of what some excellent citrine jewels look like once they're carved and faceted. When we talk about citrine, there's really two different groups that are interested in citrine, and they have different ideals and standards for what makes citrine really desirable and beautiful, which is part of why citrine can be complicated to identify fakes or talk about what fakes are on the market. So there's the jewelers and those interested in jewelry and very nice gemstones that are like cut faceted um, and embedded in certain things or mounted on jewelry. And then there's the community of people that are like avid crystal collectors and use more of like the natural or raw crystals or larger pieces that are just cut and polished that use those either aesthetically or for like metaphysical work. And what makes this a very big issue to tackle when we talk about fakes and what counts as a fake, what qualifies as disingenuous or real is different between the two markets, and that's what can make this a little bit complicated. I'm gonna give you enough background so that you can understand how both communities, both the jeweler's side of things and the raw natural stones markets impact each other and how it can lead to like confusion and inappropriate marketing of fakes on both sides so that you can take that information and become a more educated buyer. So we'll move on here to introduce Citrine a little bit better. This is the next website I'm going to talk about real quick. So I've found that mindat.org has like some pretty good authentic representations of things. So this is a little display they have of like some different citrines All of these, as you can tell, they're not as saturated in yellow as like the jeweler's examples over here. All of these citrines are referenced from like different parts of the world, as you can see down here. And they have an array of colors. Some of them are clear, some of them are more of that yellow hue we saw before, and then a little bit of them can be smoky, and that depends on what parts of the worlds they came from and like what the individual mines had as these crystals formed, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I wanted to mention that citrine is a variety of quartz, and you can see that in the chemical composition with the silica dioxide. So this is like the building block formula that makes the crystalline structure of all quartz. That's going to be important later when we talk about some of the fakes out there, because a lot of the fakes come from like different variants of quartz. Natural citrine presents itself as having even coloration throughout the crystal, regardless of if it's a paler yellow or a more saturated yellow, whether it's darker or more smoky. The natural citrines that come out of the earth have this even coloration. They also have a crystal structure that's based on like a hexagonal crystal structure. So it also has a hardness scale of 7, which we'll talk about a little later, comparing it to other materials used to fake it. And it also has a trigonal structure, which is a variation of a hexagonal crystal structure, and all quartz variations have this. Some other fakes we'll see don't have a hexagonal crystal structure, and when you're talking about raw stones, it's easy to see the difference. This is the next website I'm looking at real quick. This one's like more of a blog, but I cross-referenced all of the blogs that I looked at because some of them have done research and are like really knowledgeable, and some of them are kind of questionable. I want to introduce what some different citrines look like. So you can see there's an array of colors based on how much of the different impurities have been lodged within citrine here. So some of them are a little more yellow, some of them are smoky, some of them look a lot more clear, some of them are presented as like that like pale straw yellow that we talked about. I'm going to give a little bit more of a background on what gives citrine its color. Then I'm going to move on to talking about why we care as crystal enthusiasts if citrine is faked or not faked, and then I'm going to unpack the different types of fakes that have been used thus far at the time of filming. So I'm going to go through how glass has been used to fake citrine, and then I'm going to talk about quartz itself and different treatments that have been applied to quartz to make it look like citrine. I'm going to talk about very briefly how topaz has been mislabeled as citrine in the past, and then I'm going to cover smoky quartz, and I'll finish up with probably the biggest, most common fakes that you can get, especially if you're talking about carved gemstones or semi-precious stones, and that's going to be treating amethyst to look like citrines. I have timestamps in the description of this video in case you want to skip ahead or revisit like a certain material for your reference later. Thank you, gemdat.org, for being our next reference here. This website shows a couple different spectrums of what has been called citrine, and it ranges from a very dark color, almost reddish, through some darker orange hues, which I have some suspicions about. Then there's the pale straw yellows, and eventually some that are more in like the yellow-green spectrum. All of these references are cut gemstones, so you have to realize that this is coming from like a jeweler's perspective when they compiled this. The nice thing about this website, which this one will be linked below for your reference, is that they tell you with their level of knowledge whether or not they believe treatments have been made on these gemstones. So if you're worried about whether they're like authentic or heat treated, this website tries to be very transparent with that. So you can click on all of them and you can see some of them have treatments made to them. Something interesting I want to note on this website is that they tell you if we're talking about natural citrine, generally what you'll see is something in like the weak yellow to light yellow range, but citrine itself is recognized as going from a dark golden brown or dark yellow all the way up to light yellow. So a lot of the color spectrum is derived from the fact that you can treat certain things or certain citrines, as we'll see in a minute. And I put it in quotes because you'll see why when we're talking about other crystals being treated to give a richer color. But what citrine gets its color from and why it's different from clear quartz or other quartz varieties is the fact that it has iron and aluminum deposited within it. This is really important here, and I love that they cite their sources. So you can see this is from a reputable source from Gemologist's publication in 2011 because there are a lot of blogs out there and there's a lot of jewelers out there and there's a lot of like misinformation or disinformation depending on their intents that will tell you that citrine gets its color just from iron, and that's because if we take something else like amethyst, which gets its color from iron, and you treat it a certain way, it will give you a darker, richer color than what most citrine is found as. So it will give you the like the very dark yellow or the golden brown color that they highlight a lot here. So my thoughts on this, my suspicion, and again, I'm not a gemologist, but my suspicion here is that the aluminum that citrine has deposited within it, as well as the level of iron in it, is what causes it to be more of a light yellow than like this golden brown. And amethyst isn't recognized as having a lot of aluminum within it, like a significant amount within it. So when it's heated, it's just the iron that makes it change its color to golden brown. It's not balanced out by aluminum or the quantity of aluminum and iron, the ratio within it. So those are my thoughts, and we'll talk about that more in a second. So I guess that's a teaser. The other thing I want to mention here that will become important when we talk about comparing citrine to glass and some other crystals is that citrine doesn't fluoresce if it's natural citrine. So one of the things you can do if you're worried you have a fake is sometimes if you hit it with a UV light, you'll see that the fake may fluoresce. It doesn't always fluoresce, not all fakes fluoresce, but if someone tells you that they have a piece of citrine and it happens to fluoresce, then they're mistaken or they're trying to pass something off as a fake. Okay, so if we're talking about the actual crystal structure, which is how the crystal will appear, this is what the trigonal system looks like in a nutshell, just to give you an idea of what's going on here. And more specifically, it's a derivative of the hexagonal system here. So what happens is you have these little mini hexagons that are made, and ultimately you can divide this up into four different axes here, and three of those are equal lengths apart, so you get this symmetry that repeats itself if you rotate the object 120 degrees to, you know, have like three different sides or rotations that will all look like the same symmetry. So they're kind of symmetrical in like three different ways around one axis. And let me exit out of this picture. So if you want to hear more about that, you can go to this website. It did a pretty good job of explaining it and provided like the nice image. So it's the Britannica website over here, and this is the URL up top for you if you want that. And I just wanted to talk really quickly about why we should worry about if our citrine is fake or not fake, if it really matters. From an aesthetic standpoint, it's all about preference. So if you think that heat treated amethyst is prettier when you're looking at jewelry, then there isn't really like an issue here outside from maybe if you want to tell people this is authentic because it makes you feel better, or it's more of like a prestige thing for you, like that's fine. But from a metaphysical standpoint, which is generally what I'm going to be approaching all of these fakes by, it's important to understand if your crystals are the real deal, or if they're a different material or a different crystal being mislabeled, because what happens is each material and each crystal has a different chemical structure, which means that the structures will vibrate differently. Each crystal will be on a different vibration and a different like energy or wavelength, however you want to call it. And will that will manifest as different metaphysical properties. So if you're using these crystals for like meditation or energy work or energy healing of any kind, as you become more in tune with that, or if you already are, you'll start to notice that fake materials or fake crystals won't actually give you the energies you're expecting them, the real crystal, to give. So if you're using citrine for energy work, but you have like a fake piece of citrine, it's glass or it's smoky quartz that's been mislabeled, they will perform differently, and so it may bother you when you're doing energy work. And I have just like a couple references I like to talk about with this. I'm not going to read like this whole publication here for you, but physicists here were able to reliably measure that atoms within molecules and the molecular bonds between atoms do impact vibrations and the vibration of a material as a whole. So if you have a crystal that has a different chemical structure than another one, their vibrations do in fact change. And there's a highlighted portion here if you want to pause and read that, or you can, find the paper. I'll link it below. And then I have like one more source that just talks about that. This is the conclusion of a whole study. But if you have impurities or variances in the chemicals or amounts of atoms that are making up a crystal, all of those will disrupt the crystalline structure, and that will in turn lead to different vibrations within the crystal itself. So the lattice of the crystal, or the organization of the atoms that make the crystalline structure, will change, and that changes the vibration. So this does in fact matter if you're approaching buying your crystals from a metaphysical standpoint with the intentions of using it for energy work. So that's my 2 cents on why you might care and why you might want to become a more educated buyer. Thank you, Unearthed Gemstones. Now, they have a lot in this article that's important, and we'll unpack it all from a second. So we have another example of how the cut gemstones, the desirable gemstones, have this really rich, dark, more amber almost esque hue, and I do want to talk about that. But we'll do that in a second. It's also hard to tell with pictures that are taken with the intention of getting a lot of attention, showcasing a specific piece for sale, things like that. Generally, they get enhanced in some way because it makes it more attractive to the buyer if they're scrolling through a site. So it's hard to know if all of these pictures are enhanced or not enhanced. But you can see that this has more of a straw hue, even if it is saturated, versus this one, which is more amber in color. What I really wanted to talk about, because we'll get to all the other images in this blog later, but I wanted to talk about glass first because I think it's one of the easier ones to interpret whether or not there is a fake. So for glass, you can find it in many forms. Sometimes it's trickier when you see it as a bead because the beads are so small. But if we're talking about glass, one thing you can do is a scratch test. I wouldn't recommend this if you're worried about if your potential piece of citrine is real or not, and you end up scratching a piece that you really like. But if you're super curious and you don't mind and you know how to do it, um, the citrine and generally all quartz is going to be at a Mohs scale of hardness of 7, whereas glass is softer. It's at a it's usually around like a 5.5. This can vary on the type of glass, but when we're talking about glass that's used to fake quartz, it's generally somewhere around 5.5. So sometimes you can see that the glass specimens will be scratched by steel or another piece of quartz itself, whereas generally citrine will not be scratched by steel or another piece of quartz or citrine. And again, that depends on like how you're doing your scratch test. So this is a disclaimer, please don't scratch pieces you really like. The other thing is, if you know how to measure refractive indexes, you can see a difference in the way that light will pass through and get refracted through quartz and other pieces of citrine compared to glass. So if you have a way to measure this, or if you're really curious about if a certain piece of citrine is authentic, you can pay certain experts like gemologists or specific jewelers who have the equipment to actually measure this for you, and give you a good answer. The other thing that you can look at is, you can look at a magnified version of the pieces that you're curious about. So I have some example images for you later, but glass under a microscope or under extreme magnification will look very different from citrine. And so if you're curious, you can also take this to an expert and they'll be able to look at it magnified for you as well, if you are suspicious and super curious. The other thing I want to mention before I move on to some of my examples of what fake glass versus citrine looks like is, if you have the ability to look at these pieces in person, you can also feel the glass and the citrine. And when you get acquainted with crystals, you'll understand that crystals generally feel very cool to the touch. And the way that a crystal will feel versus glass is very different. So, like, glass won't feel as cold, and the longer you hold the glass, like the less cold it will feel. And so citrine, when you hold it for a long period of time, it will still feel a lot cooler than glass. It takes longer to heat up. But I realize not everyone can like hold their pieces in person because you're buying a lot of this over the internet, and that can cause like some issues with, you don't get to look at this with a UV light. You can't feel it in person and see if it's hard enough or if it's cold enough or this or that. So I'm gonna give you some examples of what it looks like when you hit citrine versus glass with the UV light first, and then I'll talk about some other things you can look out for to hopefully help yourself become more aware of things. Shout out to Bella Luna Crystal on TikTok. Go show her some love if you want to. This video is pretty nice. So she has a UV light, and then she has her glass here versus citrine. And what you can see is that the UV light passes straight through the glass pretty clearly, and the glass is showing up mostly blue because the dye that they use for the glass happens to react that way. But with citrine, there's no reaction to the UV light, so that purple color it presents itself in the shadow around the table looks the same as the actual piece of citrine itself. Okay, my next source here is Suzna Gems and Jewelry. I wanted to put this in here really quickly for one little tidbit of information. Citrine is usually at a density of around 2.6 to 2.7 grams per centimeter cubed, whereas if we go to our next source over here, glass generally has a density of 2.2 grams per centimeter cubed, which means if you have the ability to weigh pieces of citrine versus glass, if they're both the same size, you'll see that the glass fakes are lighter. Not everyone has the luxury of doing that. Shout out to this source. The next thing I wanted to talk about, thanks to Morigna, is the appearance of glass is very different from the appearance of citrine. So one thing that can't be avoided when glass is crafted into all these different shapes is air bubbles, and more skilled craftsmen may be able to avoid some of the larger air bubbles that you can see easily with the eye, like this one and this one here. But the air bubbles will always be present just because of the way in which glass is formed. So at a magnified view, you'll be able to detect air bubbles regardless. But this may be able to be something that can help you distinguish between glass fakes and citrine specimens when you're looking online if you can see some air bubbles here. So I have some magnified pictures. These are from geminclusions.com. So this is a magnified image of a glass imitation emerald. One thing you'll notice about very tiny bubbles in glass is they generally present themselves as spheres, whereas if we talk about other types of gemstones, sometimes they can have things that look like air bubbles, but they're generally not spheres. Which brings us to MGC, the Moscow Gemological Center's website, and they have examples of, okay, here's a pretty dark colored citrine here, but they have examples of these different inclusions you can find within citrine, and some of them may look slightly like air bubbles, even though they're not. But you'll notice that none of these are those perfect spheres that we saw when we were talking about glass. So if you are really curious about a piece that you have, you may be able to take it to somebody who has the means to like look at these at higher magnifications and see the differences. I hopped over to Etsy real quick. Thank you to New Crystal 2020 for this example. So this is smelting quartz, and they market it as that. They're not trying to sell you necessarily a fake crystal, even though they say crystal obelisk here and crystal healing. Okay, so maybe they are trying to fence it as real, but sometimes you'll see with glass, not always, when a seller that's selling a piece of glass that they're trying to mimic as being a crystal, they'll dye it in a way to where you see a lot of these streaks in it, so the color is very non-uniform. Natural citrine has a uniform color, so if you see glass that's more in the yellowy range of hues and someone's trying to sell it as citrine, if the color isn't evenly distributed throughout the whole piece, then that can be a tip off that this is glass. And I kind of like this example because this is something that you can pick up on online. Um, and like a lot of other tips I was able to give you, you kind of can't do that. So I hope that this one becomes more useful. And I know this is an extreme example because this is clear and red, but I have more examples of this being done in a way that's closer to citrine fake. I wanted to quickly pop back to the Three Marigna site that we used earlier. Thank you again, awesome blog writers, because they also have examples of the smelted quartz. So you can see it's got these like streaky colorations that sort of like have a bend to them, like a flow, because the glass had to flow somewhere when they made it. You can also see these little white spots everywhere are air bubbles. So the air bubbles aren't always perfect spheres, but when you magnify the glass piece, they will be very spherical. Although some of these are circles. I'm just saying, on if the bubbles are big enough to be seen with the human eye, they won't always come out that way. Just to give you a heads up. They also have an example of blue smelting quartz here. So you can see this one's a little less streaky. These are more like patchy colorations, but they still have movement to them, and the whole piece isn't evenly colored. This is something that we see a lot with smelting quartz, and it's still beautiful. Like if this is your thing, then there's nothing wrong with that. Go crazy. But I just want to point this out to you for those of you that have the intentions of using a citrine piece as a metaphysical tool, like an energy work or healing tool. Glass will not give you the same vibrations or energies as citrine, so buying a glass fake can be really disappointing. Moving on here to a blog by Amethyst Goddess. I think this example of yellow glass being passed off as citrine is important because there was like a little trend of this happening lately. We saw it in the TikTok video where the piece of glass has more of an even coloration to it, but this piece of glass is kind of given away as being glass based on the shape and the edges that are on it. So citrine will almost never have a shape like this where it's pretty rounded on the edges, even though it's not polished, and the edges have that characteristic, almost like sheets have been like cut or shaved off it. And that's something that if you're really a big fan of like raw obsidian, you've seen a lot, because obsidian is a glass structure. It has kind of that classic broken glass if something shattered surface texture, whereas natural citrine that comes out of the ground won't generally have that. It has smoother faces like what you see on quartz. So citrine doesn't have like this rough kind of broken up or like sheared texture on the surface that this piece of glass has. With all that said, we are now on a Reddit post. So thank you to this thread here. So this is an example of a beaded bracelet that somebody has, and what you can see in these individual beads, if you look closely, maybe I can zoom in a little bit here. If you look closely, the coloration isn't evenly distributed. It has these little like brown swirls or streaks in it, which is a lot more indicative of what you'll see in a glass counterpart. And down here, it's hard to know if these are scratches or not. I don't know how worn this bracelet is without being in person, but these almost look like little air bubbles that got stuck. So it's hopefully a little bit easier to see that glass has like a very non-conformic aesthetic to it. Like the color isn't evenly distributed. You can see patches that are more clear than like more yellow based on the beads. And there's these little like flecks and air bubbles everywhere, whereas citrine doesn't have these brown streaks in it. And so even though the beads are on a much smaller scale, hopefully this gives you an idea of what to look for. Because I think that a lot of fakes are sold in the form of these little beaded bracelets, just because beads are so small. Sometimes it's easier to make them look authentic, especially if your buyer is going to be trusting you instead of kind of being skeptical off of the bat. So it's just something to be aware of, because some people out there are unfortunately being scummy with what they're selling. I have this example from Etsy, so thank you Etsy again, and thank you Crystal Cave Company for this example, I guess. So they call it smelting quartz right off the bat, but then they're doing that same thing again where they call it a crystal right afterwards. And I have some opinions about that, because that can be misinterpreted very easy, and I don't know if that's their intention or not, is to make people think that smelting quartz is an actual type of crystal. But they also call it opalite, which opalite is not opal. Opalite is the glass mimic of real opals. So I don't know, but regardless of their intentions, I'm gonna thank them for this example, because at first glance these look like they could be some kind of version of citrine or some other pale crystal, especially because they're tumbled, so you don't have that natural structure to go off of when you're making your assessment. But hopefully these will start to look a little bit fake to you, because the coloration isn't even across them. So if I zoom in again here, you can see that some patches are a little more clear and others are a little more yellow. There's some of these like let me see if I can zoom in more, since my mouse is a circle instead of a pinpointed arrow for you. You can see that there's these odd little streaks here of colors and other things that aren't evenly distributed. There's like a couple specks of color within it, and the color isn't the same color throughout. So some of it's like a little more pink and some of it's a little more yellow, and that's also like a big giveaway that this isn't actually citrine, because citrine doesn't have any pink varieties in it. And I know some of that is the light reflecting off it, but it still gives the point across, because citrine won't have light reflect off it that's pinkish. So over here you can see like the difference in the color here. And I know that these guys aren't marketing this specifically as citrine, but it's in that ballpark of that pale straw yellow to where if somebody was going to be really tricky about smelted quartz, this is roughly how it would be passed off as citrine. And I think that's just something to be aware of because you might come into this through like other avenues besides just online. Like there could be in-person sellers. This could happen like 5 years from now, 5 days from now, 5 months from now. Like we don't know when somebody will try to sell a fake version of a crystal. So I'm just trying to educate you and hopefully it's helpful. I have another example here. This one is from the Gypsy Soul Store. So they also call this a smelt, but they call it an obelisk crystal. And in their description, they talk about how there are properties of citrine here, which implies that they're telling you that this obelisk they're selling has citrine properties because it's classified as citrine, I would assume. So I don't know how much they're trying to mislead you. I don't want to like, say something and start some drama, but this is also a fake of citrine and it's a more passable one than some of the other ones that we looked at. And that's probably because they're clearly trying to imply that it is citrine. But what you can see, especially in this photo here, is that the color isn't evenly distributed, which is a big giveaway. The dye has that like streaky thing we've seen from glass. This one has air bubbles in it right here and right here. And this one down here has quite a few. All of these little like lighter colored dots here are air bubbles. I also don't know what this weird like texturing is on it that looks almost scale-ish with all of these little outlined circles. I don't know if there's light reflecting off of something when they were taking the image or if the glass was impressioned by something as it was cooling. I'm not sure. But the streaks and these yellow bubbles here and the fact that the color here is it's not like a straw or pale yellow, it's really bright. It's this dye is a lot more of like a manufactured color you would see when someone is using like a bright yellow glass dye. And I guess that just understanding what the different expected colors of yellow are for citrine comes with the territory of looking at it for a while. I think that their beginning photo here, you can also see it with the white in this middle tower, so it's a little bit patchy. And as you go down to the bottom of the tower here, it turns into a little bit of like a darker color, and a normal citrine won't do that. If it's some kind of smoky or some kind of clear, it will be that smoky or that level of clear throughout the piece. Next example I have for you is from AliExpress. This one is an obelisk form again, and it's called a smelting stone, but then they say crystals afterwards again. And it also says quartz crystals for Reiki healing. If you're doing any kind of energy work, using a genuine piece of citrine versus glass is going to be very different. The smelting implies it's glass, but then they call it quartz all over the place. So it's up to you on thinking if they have like intentions of deceiving you or not. But what you'll see again with this image here is that there's streaks in it of color that aren't evenly distributed. And the streaks have that classic flow that glass has. These little imperfections here are from the glass making process. These look a lot like the one from our last example, actually. Those are probably air bubbles, like quite large ones, and the quality of the picture is just low enough to make you think that they're not, or suspect that they might not be. Also, a piece of citrine this large isn't something you're going to find at a price point like this, even if it is a wholesale price point. So, one other thing I didn't mention before is that you can look at the prices these things are being sold for, and sometimes fakes will be at a price point that's like unreasonably low. Um, but sometimes because they are fakes, the price point will be at the same point or a little bit higher than what is average for the citrine market. So I didn't want to capitalize on that point. That's why I'm just briefly mentioning it now. But if you do see a price point that's like way too good to believe, that should raise some skepticism because it's likely there's a reason it's too good for reality, and that is that the reality is it's not actually citrine. And there can always be exceptions, but I'm just saying like that can be a reason to reach out to the seller and ask for like videos of the crystals or more information or where they got it from instead of simply just going along with it. So in this big piece here, you can see like this line of all of these specs, and if the quality of this was better, you would know for sure they're air bubbles. But like these three down here, there's no way that those aren't air bubbles. They're shaded just like them, where they have like a much lighter outside, and then they get a little darker on the inside. I think this one is also a really good example of an air bubble, even at low quality. And so I really hope that helps because even though this one looks like the color might be a little more even, like throughout from every time I scroll over this, the image changes. But from here to about here, the color looks pretty even, even though it's not. But down here, you can see that there's a lot more yellow that got kind of stuck at the bottom. So, and then there's this patch right here, which is streaks of some kind of colored glass. I really hope that. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So this has a ton of air bubbles in it and lots of streaks of dye. So I really hope that this is a helpful example for what to look for. And again, this one isn't being specifically sold as citrine, but it looks just like the one we looked at before this that was implying it was genuine citrine. So you never know when a seller's going to do that to you, and it's just kind of nice to be an informed buyer if the authenticity of your citrine is important to you. I wanted to revisit the Essential Chi Jewelry website that we looked at before in their blog right here because they have the first example I'm going to give you for fake citrine simply being just mislabeled quartz. So sometimes you'll see quartz get passed off as citrine. This generally doesn't happen if you're talking about jewelry, and that's because there are other means of faking citrine that are way more effective and not that much more expensive because citrine is at a price point like much higher than normal quartz. But for the crystal specimen and like raw crystal community, sometimes you will see quartz get passed off as citrine. So this talk is going to be more focused around that rather than cut and polished stones that jewelers will use. But one of the big giveaways for if your citrine is genuine or if it's being passed off as quartz is that sometimes people will try to sell you like a quartz cluster as citrine. And citrine simply just doesn't grow in large clusters. Sometimes there will be like a couple points next to each other. Sometimes other smaller points of something else can be growing on the citrine. But a large cluster like this isn't something that we've seen natural citrine grow as. So if you see a large cluster or like something that looks like a geode or something that has like many teeth and druses on it, it's 99% of the time not going to be authentic citrine. And I want to shift gears and talk about different ways to color quartz to look more like authentic citrine. So this is a paper that was published in Science Direct, and I'm not going to read this whole paper for you because it is really dense, being like a scientific publication from experts. I'll have it linked if you want to read the whole thing yourself. But what this paper explores is talking about being able to coat quartz crystals with iron, and that gives it a coloration that is closer to that of authentic citrine. So in the past, it has been sold as citrine, even though it's really not. I think the reason that you don't see this with jewelers and like cut and faceted specimens is because the coating that would be applied after cutting the stone wouldn't hold up well over time, and it would be quite easy to discover it's a fake later, like if it was accidentally like polished again or cut on something um, or the jewelry gets repaired later. I think it's just they had the jewelry. What you'll see later is that the whole jewelry marketing and production side of things, they have easier, more available ways to fake citrine that they employ instead. So essentially what happens here, and again I'm not going to read the whole publication, is just that quartz itself is coated with specific types of iron, including iron oxides, and when those bind with the surface, they then take on a coloration that's close to that of citrine. Our first example here is from Nambian Brandberg crystals, so thank you. And what they're showing here is, again, a quartz cluster, and citrine won't show up as clusters like this, so that's another like big giveaway sometimes. And this cluster itself, it has more of that amber-esque color rather than the pale yellow or like the smokier hues that we see most of the time with natural citrine. So the coloration can also be a good example, or a good giveaway of what's going on here. The last thing I want to mention is that even though the whole surface is coated, you don't necessarily see an even distribution of color. So some of these points are much lighter, some of these points are darker. This point right here has darker edges to it and some areas that are lighter. On this zoom up here, you can see the point is much darker than the rest of it. This point is darker than the rest, and that could be from the blue background coming through, but I wouldn't say so. Like these edges just seem richer than the base of the same point. The other thing you'll see is that these right here, this more opaque region, right there and right there, that's because this quartz cluster had white roots on it, and then the points of that cluster were most likely clear. So when you coat this in iron, the clarity or the opacity of the quartz is still going to show through to some degree. And that's what we're seeing is these little like white roots that this quartz cluster of points is on. And one thing to note that's really important is that citrine doesn't have white roots. And these guys, I'm not saying they're passing this off as citrine. This is just like a really transparent example because they're telling you exactly what this material is. Our next example of iron-coated quartz is from Pink Heart Healing, so thank you to them. And this quartz that's iron-coated here, again, it comes in cluster form, so they're being like very nice and authentic here. They're telling you it's iron-coated quartz, so we're not calling them out. But if you see this trying to be sold as like a citrine cluster, you know that that's not authentic, because citrine doesn't grow as a cluster, the coloration isn't even throughout it, and a lot of points on here have like some white root systems on them. I will say that I haven't seen a lot of iron coated quartz being mislabeled in the market lately, and I think that has a lot to do with the popularity of heat treating amethyst, which we will talk about in a minute here. The last thing I did is I just typed iron coated quartz into Etsy here so you can see that not all iron quartz looks the same. Like this one here, this first specimen, this looks a little bit more like what you could find citrine looking like, because it's not in like a big cluster. It has the lighter yellow color, but the coloration isn't even throughout. There's a little bit of white here, and citrine just won't really exhibit that for you. So hopefully you would still be able to recognize something like this as not being genuine citrine. Like if it didn't have like the iron coated quartz label here, you would still know it's not citrine. And I just have one more example from Gandhara Gems that I think does a good example of showing you how people in the past have tried to pass this off as citrine, because the coloration on this one, even though it's a little patchy, like up here is more clear, up here's a little more opaque, down here it still has like a little bit of clarity and a little bit of cloudiness to it. the coloration's pretty even and it's a lot more yellow. So like if someone were gonna try to tell you this is citrine, there's a chance that um you wouldn't think they're trying to deceive you. And these guys aren't, they're very clearly saying it's iron coated quartz again. But that's the last example I have to show you like how people have tried to do this in the past. I want to move on to briefly mentioning Topaz. Now, Topaz has been marketed as citrine in the past. I don't really think I've seen that happening at all lately and for a while now. But because it's happened, I figured I would mention it just to bulk out the history of citrine and know what has happened in the past so you can be aware of it. I think based on the images we had earlier from mindat.org with their citrine post shows you quite clearly that citrine and topaz are different, and it's on a lot of bases, one of which is the color, but also just the structure of topaz is quite different. Topaz also has like aluminum in it, which may help give it colorations closer to citrine because citrine gets its color from aluminum and iron, as far as we know. But topaz having fluorine in it does have a different chemical structure, which means that it will vibrate differently and give you different metaphysical benefits than citrine. My next example of topaz comes from Geology Science, their blog. So they have some identifications here. One thing you'll notice if you're not acquainted with topaz is that it comes in a variety of colors. So the yellowy version here that has a hue similar to citrine is the only one that's being passed off. But if we scroll down here, what I really want to talk about is the fact that the crystal structure itself is different. So instead of having a crystal structure that has a hexagonal like base unit to it, this one instead is orthorhombic. And we're going back to the Britannica website real quick here where we defined the hexagonal units, the that the trigonal structure comes from that is citrine, and the orthorhombic unit is quite different. So this one instead is basically rectangular. And what that means is that on a large scale, the crystals will look very different. Back to our geology science blog here, you'll notice that these have like just a different shape to them. They look a little more rectangular. So like the edges on these things are still quite flat, which we've seen before, but the angles of the edges of two edges meeting are quite different, and these things have a boxier appearance to them rather than a lot of the crystal points you see don't necessarily look like a box. And that's because the angles that these crystals end at are 90 degrees instead of a different degree here. We're back to Etsy. Thank you to Raw Gemstone as a seller as an example of how the edges of these crystals present themselves. You can see, hopefully a little better in this example, how raw topaz pieces have different edges than citrine does. So these things have edges that present themselves with like a lot more harsh lines, a lot more beveling to the different faces of these crystals, and they generally take on chunks that look a little more rectangular, a little more like kyanite, where they have like all of these little tiny beveled corners that'll stack up into slopes instead of actually having like surfaces that are at more sloped angles. I wanted to move on to Nose Jewelry and their website real quickly because I think they do a really good job in this sentence here of telling you why we don't really see topaz being passed off for citrine anymore. And it's simply because citrine has a lower market price than topaz does at this point. So there's no need to counterfeit or mislabel topaz as citrine because you won't gain anything from it. Now it would probably be more likely, perhaps, that citrine or citrine fakes would get mislabeled as topaz. I'm not saying that's happening, I'm just saying that's how someone who's making fakes would gain money, not the other way around. So that is all I have for you for today. The second part is going to talk about smoky quartz and amethyst, the controversies around them. So that part will be labeled as part two of the fake citrine discussion. It'll be dropped in a couple days from now. And when it does, I'll add a link to the description of this video so that it's easier to navigate if you find this video at a later time. If you have any other questions, you can always email us or leave a comment and we'll get back to you when we can. So I hope you have a wonderful day and I'll see you in the next video.